I think number one, this is, I'm sure that most of you know this, that bad news travels fast, right? Faster than good news for sure. So that's one. That's one. The other thing that I would say in terms of news when you think about it, that the negative news travels, there can be a bad story and it will be out in less than 15 seconds. Now, what's interesting about the crisis world is that you could have a crisis, and I would say about a quarter of the crises that happen travel internationally around the world in less than 10 hours. Now, compare that to some of the research that we've done where corporations take at least 10 to 15 hours to put out a meaningful statement, right? So by the time that you are organized internally and you are figuring out what to say, you will already have lost the game because you're about 10 or 15 hours behind the curve. That's just really critical.
Why,
yeah,
to interrupt you, why do you
Sure.
think that companies wait so long, and what's like the ideal time frame to respond?
It's too much deliberating. In the sense that ultimately somebody has to make a decision about what to say. And so, oftentimes, particularly when legal issues are involved, sometimes companies don't want to say anything because they want to say no comment. I can think of 1,000 ways to say no comment without saying no comment. But you need to be very deliberate in your word choice. You need to already have a communication system plan in place in your company so that when something happens like this, you are ready to go. That it should not take that kind of time. You lose so much ground because within that 10 or 15 hour lead time that you're behind in, the narrative is already set in. And so you are behind the curve, which is not good. Another insight I would say is that oftentimes people get overwhelmed. You get these social media reports and it says, spike up in Twitter and Facebook, and it's the level of conversation that frightens people. But oftentimes I think what you want to focus on are the key influences. Like all conversation is not equal. And so you want to focus on what and who is driving the conversation so you can get at the root of it, basically. That makes sense.
Makes sense to me. I'm curious. So let's actually I want to take some questions from the audience, but before that, let's take an example of a non-client that you can talk about, and I want to hear like what you would have done differently there. Okay. So let's start with Wells Fargo.
Well, let me just see here. Let me think of the top few things that they were. Well, first of all, it took a very long time to say something. That would be number one. I think number two, there was a lack of transparency. Did you like the way I said it? Yeah, a lack of transparency in dealing with the issue. And I also think one of the key things that was clearly a problem there was a lack of responsibility and ownership, right? I can't tell you how much that goes a long way. A good contrast to that, I think, is the CEO of General Motors, who has done a very good job at owning up. We made a mistake. This is horrible. This is what we're going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again. But it wasn't that kind of ownership there. And also, too, I think there was a huge delay and also not understanding the magnitude of the level of outrage of customers and employees. And it was just a huge disconnect there, huge disconnect.